I still remember the atmosphere on that flight like it was yesterday.
You know how sometimes a flight feels calm, almost like a floating hotel in the sky, and other times, there's this tension you can't quite describe.
This one was the second kind. From the moment we took off, you could tell the cabin wasn't entirely at ease.
People were tired, some were restless, a baby was crying a few rows back, and the usual clinking of meal trays mixed with the shuffle of footsteps down the narrow aisle.
Nothing dramatic, just the normal chaos of being 35,000 feet above ground.
But what caught my attention was a mother and her daughter, maybe just 2 rows ahead of me.
The girl couldn't have been more than 14.
Young, emotional, and clearly not happy about something.
The mother, on the other hand, was trying hard to control the situation,
but her voice carried that edge of frustration parents get when patience is running thin.
At first, it was just sharp whispers,
a little back and forth,
but gradually, it grew louder.
You know that moment when passengers start turning their heads, curious, a little annoyed, wondering what's going on.
That was the vibe.
I noticed a few people shifting in their seats, some raising their eyebrows, some sighing quietly the way travelers do when they'd rather just get some peace.
And then came the breaking point.
The girl stood halfway up, her face flushed, her voice rising against her mother's. She refused to sit back down, tears forming in her eyes, her hands trembling as she clutched the seat in front of her.
It wasn't just a teenage tantrum, it was raw emotion spilling out,
the kind that makes everyone around uncomfortable because you don't know whether to intervene or just look away.
I glanced at the crew, and I could see the flight attendants exchanging looks. They're trained for this kind of thing, but you could tell they were deciding who should step in. That's when Ahmed, one of the attendants, approached. Now, here's what struck me about him.
His demeanor was calm, steady, almost soothing.
You know, when someone carries themselves with that quiet authority, like they've handled situations 100 times before, that was him.
He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to the girl's eye level, speaking in gentle tones.
From where I sat, I couldn't hear every word, but I could see the way he was trying to bridge the gap.
He gestured calmly, pointing to her seat, encouraging her to sit down, reassuring her that everything was fine. And slowly, she began to respond, not much, but enough that she hesitated instead of continuing the argument. The tension in the air began to thin just a little. Passengers turned back to their meals, the sound of the beverage cart rolling down the aisle resumed. It felt like Ahmed had managed to diffuse the situation, at least temporarily.
I can still see that moment play out in my head, the way Ahmed leaned in, the way his hand rested lightly on the girl's shoulder, and that kiss on the forehead. Now, here's the thing. Depending on where you're from, that gesture could mean completely different things. And that's exactly where this entire story takes a turn. Because to me, sitting there as an observer, it looked like compassion. It looked like fatherly reassurance. In fact, I grew up seeing gestures like that all the time. In Arab culture, in Middle Eastern families, a kiss on the forehead isn't something unusual. It's a sign of respect, of blessing, of comfort. Parents kiss their children this way. Elders kiss the younger generation this way. Sometimes, even strangers, when they want to show empathy, will do the same. It's soft, it's respectful, and it's deeply cultural. But culture is a double-edged sword. Because while many of us might recognize that gesture as kindness, to others, it can mean something completely different. Especially in settings where personal boundaries, privacy, and consent are emphasized above all else. For the mother, that kiss was not a comforting sign. It was an invasion of space. Think about it from her perspective. Her daughter was 14, a teenager, vulnerable, emotional. And he was a man, even if he was a flight attendant, physically touching her and kissing her without asking. To her, that wasn't kindness. That was overstepping a line. And here's the part that really hit me later. Culture doesn't travel well at 35,000 feet. On a plane, you've got people from different backgrounds, different values, different expectations, all packed into one flying tube. What feels normal to one person might feel deeply offensive to another. It's like two worlds colliding in a single gesture. And Ahmed? He probably never thought twice about it. In his mind, he was doing the right thing, using a cultural expression of comfort to calm down a distressed teenager. He wasn't flirting, he wasn't trying to be inappropriate. He was simply being human. But that's the dangerous part about gestures. They carry meaning we assume is universal, when in reality, it's not. As I sat there watching the mother's reaction, her eyes sharp, her lips pressed tight, I could almost feel the air thicken. Passengers who hadn't even noticed the kiss began sensing the tension. A few exchanged looks, whispering. Others pretended not to notice, burying themselves back into their movies and headphones. But I couldn't shake the thought. This tiny act, this single kiss on the forehead, might just have consequences far bigger than anyone realizes. And sure enough, it did. Because the moment the plane touched down, the cultural meaning of that gesture would no longer matter. What mattered was the mother's interpretation of it. And once the legal system got involved, intention and cultural context would take a back seat.
The moment Ahmed kissed the girl's forehead, I knew something had shifted. It was subtle at first, but if you were watching closely, you could feel it. The mother's face hardened instantly. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, stayed locked on Ahmed as though he'd just crossed an invisible boundary. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her shoulders tensed. Meanwhile, the girl, confused, maybe embarrassed, quietly sat back in her seat. For her, it wasn't clear whether she felt comforted or uncomfortable. She didn't say much, but her silence said enough. I sat there, 2 rows back, pretending to read the in-flight magazine. But really, I couldn't take my eyes off the scene. You know that instinct you get when you sense something's about to escalate? That was the feeling crawling up my spine. Ahmed, on the other hand, looked calm, maybe even relieved. To him, the job was done. He diffused the tension, guided the girl to her seat, offered comfort. He gave a polite nod to the mother, the kind that said, "Everything's fine now." Then he moved on, continuing his duties as if nothing unusual had happened. But for the mother, nothing was fine. Her body language told a story of its own. She leaned closer to her daughter, whispering fiercely. Her eyes darted around the cabin, as though checking to see if anyone else had witnessed what just happened. Every so often, she glanced toward the galley, where Ahmed was working, her expression simmering with something between anger and disbelief. Passengers who hadn't noticed earlier began sensing the tension. You could hear it in the way conversations hushed, in the way a few people leaned ever so slightly into the aisle, curious. A man across from me raised his eyebrows, shaking his head subtly. Another woman 2 seats down muttered something to her husband, who only gave a dismissive shrug. Still, nobody spoke up. Nobody intervened. After all, we were on a plane where everything feels amplified, but at the same time trapped. As the hours dragged on and we inched closer to landing, the air grew heavier. The mother's anger didn't fade. It seemed to harden into resolve. You could see it in the way she carried herself, upright, tense, eyes fixed straight ahead. I had a sinking feeling she wasn't going to let this go. And I was right. The moment we touched down, her energy shifted from quiet rage to determined action. As soon as passengers began gathering their belongings, she stood up and walked straight toward the crew. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp, each word clipped, precise, accusing. I couldn't hear every detail, but I caught fragments. My daughter, inappropriate, without permission. Her gestures were firm, her finger pointing toward Ahmed. The crew froze for a second, clearly caught off guard. A few tried to calm her down, to reassure her, but she wasn't having it. She was resolute. She wanted her complaint heard, and she wanted it taken seriously.
Remember his expression, confusion mixed with disbelief. He raised his hand slightly, palms open, as if to say, "I didn't mean anything wrong." He spoke softly, his words calm but urgent. You could almost hear the desperation in his voice, the plea to be understood. But the mother wasn't budging. To her, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was harassment. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. It didn't matter what Ahmed intended. It didn't matter how I, or anyone else on that flight, interpreted the gesture. What mattered now was how the law would see it. And in Saudi Arabia, the law is strict. Very strict. As the rest of us shuffled off the plane, murmurs spread among passengers. Some shook their heads, whispering that the mother was overreacting. Others nodded, saying she was right to protect her daughter. I caught a few glances toward Ahmed, sympathetic from some, critical from others. Walking down that jet bridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just witnessed the start of something much bigger than a simple in-flight misunderstanding. Because this wasn't just a family drama anymore. This was about to become a legal battle. And the outcome would shock us all.